Work Wellness Institute is transforming research into workplace performance and health. As an organization, we function throughout the complete cycle of turning research into practice, mobilizing knowledge as a research institute, community partner, funder, and educational provider. Our mission of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all is our driving motivation. Learning is a lifelong journey to adapt to the forever changing needs of the workplace. Whether you are a leader, a professional, an academic, or a student, we provide high-quality resources that are evidence-based, topical, and relevant to all industries. Choose the Work Wellness Institute as your learning journey partner and become a member to gain full access to our diverse knowledge mobilization programming, including lectures on demand, e-curriculum, 3 distinct certification opportunities, and more. Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we can support transforming research into performance and health for your workplace.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you may be joining us today. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the subject of the webinar today is the why for sustainability, considerations for sustainability strategies. My name is Elizabeth White and I am the team lead of learning and development with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be here to help in hosting and moderating today's webinar. I would like to start by acknowledging I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. This webinar is made possible through the support of our funders, partners, as well as memberships to the Work Wellness Institute. And of course, we would like to thank our advisory committee and speakers who contribute to this webinar series and make it all happen. And we're very excited to have Dr. Kent Williams here with us today. Dr. Williams is an assistant professor with the F.C. Manning School of Business, Acadia University, and an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Management, Dalhousie University. He holds a Doctor of Social Science, where his research and praxis focuses on leadership studies that are underpinned by fairness, prosperity, and sustainability. The core values that lead him are courage, empathy, integrity, levity, respect, and wisdom. His purpose is to co-inspire human potential. He espouses pedagogy of education as the practice of freedom, where he facilitates learning spaces for dialogue that embraces failure, reflexivity, creativity, critical and resilient thinking. He believes this approach enables positive desired futures for living in our rapidly changing world of complexity. He lives in Wolfville, Nova Scotia with his family and has a leadership consulting practice, Integral Dialogue Project. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and I'll happily pass things over to you.
Hey, Elizabeth, thanks so much. It's really great. It's a pleasure to be here and to connect with you, all of you out there, and to talk on one of my favorite topics that I practice and research, this idea of sustainability. As you can see, the why for sustainability. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm on, Glooscap, which is part of the ancient, sacred, and unceded territory of Mi'kma'ki. And I want to acknowledge all the ancients and elders across the country that connects all of us. I think it's really important to embrace the wisdom from these elders, past, present, and future, because they really talk to this idea of reciprocity and interdependence, which I think is so important to the topic that we're talking about here today. So again, welcome to all of you. And this first image that you see here, looking through the trees, you might guess what city that is. That is Vancouver. It's a city that I lived in for 20 years. And as Elizabeth said, I'm now here on the East Coast of Canada. But when you think about all the news that you hear in the Pacific Northwest and really across the country, across the globe, there is a real concern for the increasing impact of weather events that have been termed once in a century weather events, and now they're getting to be the norm. And they're impacting, they're displacing and disrupting people and communities, again, right across our country and right across the globe. And so this really brings us this first question: why is sustainable development an important consideration for your practice today. So just to, as a check-in, we'll put that first poll question out there. So if you can answer this, why is sustainable development an important consideration for your practice today? There we go.
Apologies for the delay on that.
So yeah, you can see your choices there. And these are some of the choices that I hear from some of my students, why sustainable development is important to them, or some of the business leaders that I work with. So if you just take a moment and time, it says, yeah, just to weigh in and vote on that.
I'm seeing that things are coming in, so I'll just allow it to be open for a few more seconds and we'll close it shortly. So yes, please put in your answers.
Okay, so here I'm worried about my future, and future of younger generations. That's the top one. That's the one I hear a lot from the students I work with on a daily basis, right? So there's a plethora of reasons why sustainability is important, and also that's a common thing that it's not on my radar, that I don't know much about that. That's a common view as well, that a lot of people aren't really aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we'll talk about today. So if we could just close that, Elizabeth, and then great. So yeah, moving along. So right away, I'll share my bias. And, as a researcher, as a practitioner and researcher at the university, this is, my bias. I study and research about climate leadership and sustainable development practices. So that's the bias that I bring into today's talk with you. But also, I think that, hopefully I can provide, my goal is really to provide a compelling argument why we need to integrate sustainable development into our practice, in our communities, in our organizations, and individually, how can we be this catalyst for change and action towards more sustainable as flourishing futures, as I call it. And the number one why I think that we have to really consider sustainable development is it really meets the call for response and the responsibility that we all hold towards living more sustainable on our planet. This one image you see is from the Fall Congress, the Sustainable Development Goals Summit in 2023 in New York, where you had all countries of the world gathering to really talk about the many challenges that we face, like the grand challenge of climate change, and how do we implement the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. And I'm going to talk more about these goals and how they can really play a part. But it's loud and clear, whether it's this meeting or the Congress of the Parties meeting where world leaders get together, or the recent World Economic Forum in Davos, where we get leaders of business and countries getting together to talk about challenges. We hear over and over again that sustainable development is important and that we need everybody on the planet to really engage in sustainable development. And also out of the same meeting this fall, they talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been in place since 2015. And really, the goal of the Sustainable Development Goal framework is by 2030 to really be able to meet these 17 goals, which I'll talk more about a little bit later on. But there was a stark message that came out of from independent scientific review saying that we're not coming close to meeting these Sustainable Development Goals. We're at the halfway point, and there's fear that we're not going to meet these goals that are really important for human development on the planet. And out of this report, this one line said, as the current rate of progress, the world will not eradicate poverty, end hunger, or provide education for all by 2030. And these are some of the pivotal goals around the Sustainable Development Goals. And probably the overarching one is to keep the climate temperature pre-industrial years at below 1.5 degree change in temperature. And we already are seeing that we've we're at that guardrail now of 1.5. And this image too is, if you walk around Halifax and wherever you may be, you are seeing the impacts of the complexity and changing economies in our landscapes. We are seeing tent cities all through our different cities. In Halifax, this is a current challenge that we face. And as I said, it's not uncommon right across our country. Also, out of the recent World Economic Forum, we are hearing this idea of inequality, which is another sustainable development goal. We are hearing increasing gaps in inequality between the wealthy elite, which we say is like the 1%. And this was some startling data that was just shared last month, that the 5 richest men, for example, have doubled their wealth since 2020. And we see 5 billion people are made poor. So yeah, there is this divide between the haves and have-not, which is creating a lot of conflict and challenges. They even say by the end of the decade, we will have our first trillionaire. And, when I listen to the voice in the research that I do, recently I did a set of interviews across the Dalhousie campus. And, the student voices are telling me that they are really concerned about the future, that they don't have a lot of hope, and that they feel like they cannot make a difference. And we also, again, this is some data that is coming out of British Columbia, some of the recent fires and floods, and just being recognized that human lives and well-being are in peril. And again, this is not just a story of British Columbia. It's a story right across our country. Nova Scotia encountered fires and floods. And, we just need to look at what's happening in California, Chile. It's happening all across the world. And then this report came out in British Columbia just yesterday that climate change is causing negative health impacts, and just saying that this is going to be an increasing challenge that we face in our country. And I think that, we live in a time where there is this clash of economic and social ecological perspectives, these old ways of showing up, and this focus on economy and shareholder primacy is clashing against concerns for the social ecological system that we live in. And this really comes to the number 2 why. Scientific truth is telling us that we really do need to live more sustainable on our planet. And some of you may wonder, what is this image? This is the first image. This was an image taken in one of the NASA missions in 1968, and Scientific America picked this up and published it in 1970. This was the first photo that was massively shared with people across the planet. So it's the first time we're able to see this living, breathing planet that we live on, and really started to change our mindsets. And, Carl Sagan would say that, we realize that we all kind of live and thrive on this tiny blue dot that is moving through the planet. But we really hold on to these myths when we think about our planet as well. And when we think about sustainable development, we talk a lot about that we need to save the planet. And if you go into your hotel room, you'll often see these placards that save our planet. And I think it should be more about we need to change the story and disrupt, and it should be more about saving humans. Because once we really understand the story of the planet, scientific truth tells us that the history of the planet is 4.55 billion years, and we've moved through all these geological epochs that are shared in this one animation. And really, when you understand the story of the planet, humans really do not show up until the very end of the timeline. This one guy, David Bauer, really puts the Earth history into a 1 year time scale. And he says in this really cool story narrative, humans don't show up, they just show up a few seconds before midnight. So really our time on the planet is very short. And I guess my point in this is that climate change is something that we've always dealt with. The Earth has always gone through these geological epochs of a change in climate. But we just have to be aware that what's happening now is a lot to do with human impacts. And we're hearing these stories over and over again. And as it says here, from a self-preservation and a human impact perspective, we cannot help be aware and alarmed of the growing pressures that we are facing on the planet. And a lot of times it can be very depressing. And a lot of times we just really want to ignore it. But we hear the scientific truth tells us that this is climate change that is by human impacts. The International Panel on Climate Change, which really is the scientific body that tracks climate change, says that it's 95% certainty that climate change is caused by human impacts. And and as I say, if you were in the pharmaceutical industry or biotech, when you get a 0.5 statistical significance, government usually will take on that drug and that will be kind of the standard of practice. But yet, even though we know that human impacts are causing climate change, we're really slow to act. And we're seeing the impacts of the human impact of climate change, where really we see from 1950 on increasing in climate temperature, which still continues to rise every year. Last July, we heard that we've hit the warmest period on the planet as been recorded by modern history, and I think that's around an average temperature of 17 degrees Celsius on the planet. But we don't need to just hear from scientific truth that these impacts are happening. These are just a few of the narratives, the stories that I've been involved with. You go to British Columbia, you see some of the clear cutting that's being done over on the island at Fairy Creek. And also, walking along the shores of Lewisburg, Cape Breton, where I have a cottage, the pristine coastline. This is kind of the garbage that I can collect on a walk along this pristine coastline. So we're seeing the impacts of humans on the landscapes and seascapes wherever we go. And I think that really speaks to our times of living in this epoch of the Anthropocene, where human influence is everywhere. And as one student shared in a post with me, this animation, that a lot of these challenges that we are facing, whether it's climate change or the pandemics, biodiversity collapse, these are all interrelational. They all are connected and continue to intensify as we move forward. So there's no doubt we live in this what's termed this rapidly changing world of complexity, this mad world where we face many challenges. So this really brings us to the next poll is, what is your biggest concern when we think about sustainability and we think about living and working in your communities? What is your biggest concern? So if you just take a moment to weigh in on that poll.
Just to keep it open for a few more seconds as people continue to answer. Okay, great. I'll share the answers now.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, costs. Okay, so 50% weighed in, said cost of living, poverty. Yeah, this is what we're I hear this from my students all the time, really concerned for their future and be able to just afford to live in their and work in their communities. And also food and water is a definite concern. Population growth. Yeah, that's the one that we often don't talk about, is this idea of population growth. You know, also we've moved in the sixth period of mass extinction, the fifth one being the dinosaurs, which was some 65 million years ago. Yeah, so if you can close that. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, so this idea of population, as someone, as a few of you weighed in on, if you go back to 1800, the world population was 1 billion. We had 1 billion people living on the planet. And I know that people can't speak, but what would you guess the population is today? And if you were to look at the world population clock, you can actually go on and look at this live world clock. It's really quite the phenomena to see. We're now sitting at 8.1 billion people on the planet, which is quite alarming. In 224 years, we've hit 8.1 billion people on the planet. And just our time together here over the 1 hour, according to the clock, it says we'll have 10,000 more people on the planet aggregate. And in this one day on the planet, we'll have another 250,000 people on the planet. So I live in Nova Scotia. The population's rate around 1 million. And so every 4 days, we get the population of Nova Scotia on the, coming added onto our planet. And what National Geographic says that predicts by 2040, if all goes as planned, as it's going, that we'll be 9 billion people on the planet. And this is like another China or India population-wise on the planet. And this is really creating, putting added pressure to our planetary living systems. And now we are, you know, we talk about living in this VUCA world, that's described as volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, or turbulent times. That is putting a lot of challenge on world leaders and as individuals living and working in our communities. And unfortunately, the complexity of a leader's mind is not keeping pace. We kind of live in kind of old narratives of where we rely on expert opinion of senior leaders to guide us. But really, the complexity of a leader's mind is not keeping pace with the changing complexity of the world. And this is a real challenge. And as we are sensing, as these images show, like population growth, climate change, loss of biodiversity, increasing conflict on the planet, inequality, poverty, late flooding, melting glaciers. So the many challenges that we face, and we don't need to listen deeply or look carefully to see that there's a looming crisis for humanity. And it's not something that's in the future. It is present right now. And there's many consequences of our modern way of constructing the world. And so I think that we really have to disrupt and look at, and disruption means about transforming the way we are seeing how we're living on the planet. And we need to break some of the myths and really look for seeds and scenarios of how we can really provide pathways to living more sustainable as flourishing on the planet. And scientific truth really recognizes that we are now living outside of the planetary boundaries that really sustain life on our planet. And again, this is some data that's was identified about 10 years ago, that show that there's these 9 planetary boundaries that really support human life on the planet. And you can see that 2009, when it was first introduced, they said we've crossed 3 of these boundaries that support life on the planet. Then 2015 is recognized 4, and the news continued to get worse this year, where they're saying we're pushing out of 6 of these planetary boundaries that support life on the planet. So we truly are living in this time of the Anthropocene, where humans have become this geological, physical force that are affecting the planetary living systems on the planet. And this is really putting tremendous pressure. And through human transformation, we are creating challenges we've never faced before. So this old expert knowledge that we had in the past isn't really helpful as we take on these new challenges. So we have to be open to new ways of doing things here on the planet. And how do we really tap into the diversity in our planet to really tackle these new challenges? And so how we've been showing up in the past, these old ways of doing have really left what I tell my students, have left these emerging leaders in a tough legacy, left them in a tough place. And so a lot of times we see on a world stage and even in our local and national levels that we are leading from a fear-based way, and we're reacting with old patterns of leading that are no longer effective. And so, as Einstein said, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we use to create them. We have to come up with new alternatives that really can transform new ways of thinking and living on the planet. And I really love this quote by Levine and Levine. They said, "What kind of thinking can embrace chaos without falling into despair?" So I think that's what we need to think about, is what kind of new thinking. And I think that we really need to lean into these conflicts and challenges, these polarities, so to speak, and be open to new creative ways of understanding. We have to let go of kind of these old stories that we've held to create these new openness to new possibilities. And I think that, so how do we do that? You know, what kind of frameworks and strategies, or what kind of seeds and snares can lead us down that road of new thinking, of transformation? And I think it's things like the planetary boundaries frameworks, things like the Sustainable Development Goals that can really allow us to dream and imagine new desired futures for this idea of human development, to save humans and not save the planet, so to speak. So this is the poll number 3. How familiar are you with the Sustainable Development Goals, which I've talked about at the beginning, and this idea of the 2030 agenda? So you just take a moment to answer that poll.
Oh, great. It's open and people are already joining, so we'll just let it ride for a few seconds here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Elizabeth.
All right, I'll share the results now.
Okay. See, never heard of them, 17%, vaguely familiar with them, and definitely have some understanding of the framework. And when I poll, I in this work, I talk to my students. Also, I work with leaders and organizations, and this is kind of what I hear. What I hear is that there's less than a 20% awareness of the Sustainable Development Goals. So yeah, this is, and they've been out since 2015. And like I said, this 2030 agenda, we're about the halfway point. So there is this need to really get out awareness around the Sustainable Development Goals. So I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about them. But before I do that, I also want to share, this is a model that I share with my students. I teach in the business school, and we talk a lot about, we know when I talk to students, they often tell me that, I ask them, what is the number one goal of an organization? And that's what I have in this one diagram, the CAS. This is a complex adaptive system, otherwise known as the organization. And a lot of times what I hear from students, they say it's this idea of shareholder profit, this idea of profit maximization. And this is kind of what the disservice that we've done to students, and even our culture. Really, we're always talking about this idea of growth economy, And whenever we have elections, the idea of economy growth and jobs are probably the number one thing. But I like to share this model that comes out of the Stockholm Resiliency Center that I call the wedding cake model. And it really kind of moves away from Ellington's model of where a triple bottom line, this idea of people, profit, and the planet, that kind of shows equally exploring this idea of people, profit, and the planet. But this model really kind of turns that on its head, and what it says, and I always get the students to kind of interpret what the model means. But really, if you really think of things from a social ecological perspective, or what you could call systems thinking, that if you really think about the economy, it's like a donut. The economy falls into society, and society falls into the biosphere. And if we don't look after the biosphere, we're not going to have a healthy society, and we're not going to have a healthy economy. And if you think of all the disruptions, all the extreme weather events that we're starting to experience, they're really impacting the biosphere, which is really affecting us in our societies. And you think of some of the things that have happened across our country, the fires and floods, and even the pandemic you could fit in there, how it's impacted society and really affected economy. We've seen that the value chain, supply chain has really been affected, and how the pandemic's a fine example how the economy was affected. And so really it's come to that realization that if we don't look after the biosphere, we're not going to have a healthy society, and we're not going to have an economy. So really, from a business and organizational perspective, we should really be thinking about how do we preserve and really enable a healthy biosphere so we can have a healthy society and healthy economy. And this brings me to the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a framework that really came out, it was born out of actually the 1948 human rights framework that Eleanor Roosevelt was the advocate for. And then we had the Millennial Goals in early 2000, and then out of the Paris COPE meeting, we had this latest rendition, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the 2030 Agenda. And the whole idea is every country in the world signed on, except I think Syria and Nicaragua for some reason or other. But we had all nations sign on to this framework, saying that they are going to implement the Sustainable Development Goals into their framework, and they're going to reach these goals by 2030. And really, these are what the Sustainable Development Goals, if you look at them, there's two key principles or elements that underpin this framework, and that is they are based in human rights. A lot of people think when sustainable development, it's all about the environment. But when you look at these are all connected to human rights, and they're universal. They really speak a universal language. Some people say they can be abstract, but there are underlying targets for every one of these goals. If you go to the UN, if you look up and Google Sustainable Development Goals right now, you will get this framework, and it gives you targets and how you can build strategies under each one of these goals. So you see, and they're all interrelated. There's no one that's more important than the other, but you can see how they are, like no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work, economic growth, industry, innovation, infrastructure. Number 10, reducing inequalities. Number 11, sustainable cities and communities. 12, responsible consumption and production. And then we get into some of the ones that consider the environment. Number 13 is climate action. 14 is life below water. And 15, life on land. And then we get into this idea of number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And number 17, which really connects them all, is really this idea of partnership for the goals. So with this framework, it's like, how do we as a world global community capture and meet these goals by 2030 is been and so how do we do it? As I said, there's the framework, but also from a business perspective, there is the UN Global Compact, which basically has organizations right across the world taking on frameworks and tools that are provided by the UN Global Compact, and this network to support one another to really bring on the SDGs. How do you implement them into your value chain? You can see, if any of you are interested in this, you can see the website that can connect you to this. But what you're seeing is a lot of organizations, we're seeing this grow and grow, but implementing the SDG framework into their value chain. And you're seeing them do it in integral ways. We're looking at it from taking that wedding cake model, where we're seeing how the SDGs connect to economy, society, and the biosphere. And we're seeing more and more elaborate ways of looking at the SDGs from the planetary boundaries framework. And we're seeing organizations doing planetary boundary analysis and framework and putting that into their business plans. There's a company called Houdini out of Scandinavia. I know Unilever is doing some work around this as well, of how to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, but also look at it from what is their impact from a planetary boundaries framework. And as some of you recognize in the poll, population concern is a real big concern. And even if we're taking on sustainable development and strategies, we still have to be concerned of the growing population. And as different countries are getting more developed and more consumer driven, what are the impacts of that? And so, as I said, humankind has a huge footprint on the planet, which continues to grow exponentially. And I think we have to be aware of this fatal flaw, as Pratarelli says, that we are consumers. We have to face that fact. And how do we become more sustainable consumers? And it's kind of hard, because we see, this is a story that just came out last week. And I know we hear a lot, especially with the Super Bowl, we hear a lot about Taylor Swift, but our cultural norms are still to ignore our individual responsibilities. And this is a story of Taylor Swift and her legal team. They want to sue this one student out of the University of Florida that is tracking all wealthy people, billionaires, of their jet travel, and he's attaching it to their impact on carbon into the planet, and just really bring awareness of that. But yet we see our society and culture holding these people, suing them, and kind of not condoning this behavior of calling people out. But I think that we really have to be aware of what our individual impacts on the planet. That we, as it says, humankind should not simply minimize their environmental footprints, but we really need to look at, what are our overall impacts, and are we staying within these planetary boundaries? And I think this is central to sustainable development. And we have these meetings every 2 years, the Congress of the Parties. We had the 26 in Glasgow, and recently 27 was in Egypt. And the data is really clear that we are not meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, that 2030 is quickly coming, and that we're not meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are consequences. As I've shared some of these stories, we are seeing the impacts of climate change. And so we hear Secretary General Guterres continually call out and really saying that we all have a part to play in this. We all have to build our awareness about sustainable development, and what are the actions we can take. So really, my one supposition is that really there's an opportunity, and it's not really to solve this planetary challenge, but how do we really embrace this idea? Climate change, human-made climate change, it is here now. We still don't know the overall detrimental impacts it's going to have on human development, but we know that it is not good. But it's not about solving the problem. That's kind of our hubris, is we always feel like we need to solve the problem. It's really, how do we adapt? How do we be resilient and really embrace this and getting to the rhythm of climate change through our actions? And so I think that it's important that we all look at what are the seeds and scenarios towards sustainable development pathways. So what can I challenge you, what can you do in your individual life, in your community, and in your organization to really to find those seeds and scenarios that can allow for pathways? And I think that and why I say, we need to look at interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches. I think that's one of the beautiful things of humankind. We have so much diversity in the communities that we're interconnected with, that we have the know-how to really create the world anew. And I can just share some of the things that are happening in the business school and the area that I work in. There really is a paradigm shift happening, and really a call for really changing the way that we're showing up in business schools. We have not done a good job at positioning students to be that positive force in their communities. It's really, again, been focused all on this idea of shareholder primacy, profit maximization. But we're really seeing that we've done a disservice to students, and we really have to change the narrative and really position students to be this positive impact in their communities. And really that, we can still be profitable, but how do we do it in a sustainable development way, and that's a positive impact on the social ecological systems that we're in. And we hear, this is an individual out of Harvard, Michael Porter, who is a professed capitalist, but he says that, there's a real opportunity for business to really take on, from a profit standpoint, to really take on social challenges, social ecological challenges, and really put some of that capital, and that's where a lot of the wealth in the world is, with these shareholders, these companies, billionaire companies, to really take on these challenges and to be impact to our social ecological systems. We're seeing, again, examples of the business school. We're seeing it bring into accreditation. Schools are being made accountable, and to bring in, to make sure that things that we're doing are creating societal impact. And I think from businesses, we could think about that as well. Like, what are the policies and rules that can be set up, and value systems that really can encourage this idea of societal impact? Again, looking at seeds and scenarios, we're looking at how do we weave sustainable development through every bit of the curriculum. And I think businesses as well, like how does an organization weave sustainable development through the value chain of their organization, or in how we interact in our communities? Again, I think that young generations get it. I think that the millennials and Gen Zs, they really get it, and they're really calling businesses out, and they want to work for organizations that are really taking social ecological responsibility. They want to work for companies that are taking on the challenge of building sustainable as flourishing futures. And also, I think that we need to look to private-public partnerships, that we can't do it alone, that one organization cannot do it alone. We need to look to private-public partnerships. We hear the former governor of the Bank of Canada in UK, Mark Carney, really speaking about this idea of private-public partnerships. A lot of the work that we're starting to do in the university, we're partnering with industry to understand how do we show up differently and act towards sustainable development. Some of these just show, like John Coyne from Unilever working with students at Dalhousie. Also, I've got an upcoming engagement where we're working with, here in the middle, that's Doug Ettinger from Canada Post, who is going to be sharing with our students later this month on some of the steps that they're taking towards being a positive impact in their communities around sustainable development. So we see this cascade of institutions right across North America investing heavily in sustainable development. Even the government of Canada in 26, just like 2 years ago, came out with their sustainable development strategy. So yeah, we see all over institutions really declaring this idea of climate change emergency and crisis, and really building sustainable development within their value chain. And this is some of the research that I'm presently undertaking at Dalhousie, and working with scholars across the globe of how do we build sustainable development pathways in our universities, in our communities, and how do we really transform the way we're educating towards enabling this idea of sustainable development. And with this research, this is one of the research events that I recently held at the Halifax Library, where we're really bringing in transdisciplinary approaches on how do we engage in sustainable development. Again, it's not relying on expert knowledge, but really engaging the voices of community on how we do it. And I think that's what we need to do in our organization, is really engage the diversity and intermingle and allow for the voices to be heard of what are seeds and scenarios. We don't have the answers, and it's really about how do we partnership together and find ways forward towards what I call sustainable as thriving futures. And I really think it's in our DNA. Adam Smith, who is kind of cherry-picked as the father of capitalists, and really was this moral philosopher out of Scotland. He said, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest in him in the fortune of others." That we really do, it's in our DNA. We really care about otherness. And so I think we have to get back to our roots of this idea of moral civic ownership and responsibility in how we show up. And I think also we have to, again, to that point made, that we have to look at different ways of knowing. We've always come at things of a Western way of knowing, kind of that expert way of knowing. We have to move beyond that, and we have to engage in other ways of knowing, being, and doing, and how these emergent ways can really enable us to look at different ways. And I love Indigenous knowledge frameworks. It really embodies this idea of interdependence and reciprocity. And I think, we really talk a lot about reconciliation with Indigenous communities, but I think we can really look to Indigenous knowledge frameworks and communities right across the world as being exemplars to how we can show up more holistic in how we live in our communities and live on the planet. And also, in the same way, I think we need to look at different ways of showing up. And I think the arts can provide beautiful ways of how we show up more holistically on the planet. And I think we're doing a lot more work, even in the business schools, of engaging in the arts to really decenter us from old ways of being, and showing creative ways of engaging in sustainable development that are more human rights based. And so I think when we look to the literature, this is what we see. We are seeing that strategies that involve more participative architecture in our organizations, in our communities, that bring this focus around how do we live more creatively, and also is all about prototyping. Again, we don't have the answer, so we need to prototype and what works, and learn from our failures. We can't be afraid to prototype, to fail, and build on our failures as learning opportunities. And so this is clear that social learning through a community of practice is really important as we embrace and engage in sustainable development. And as I get near the end here, I love this quote by Nora Bateson out of Australia. She says, our goal should not be so hubris to find solutions to our challenge, not to crack the code, but really to catch the rhythm, of this changing world that we live in. And again, from a sustainable development standpoint, we can't think of it as something separate, like we need to have a sustainable development department within our organization, or we need to teach a sustainability course in our institutions. It's really, we need to weave and integrate sustainable development through all elements and aspects of how we are showing up, how we're living in our daily practice, the practices we do in our organizations, and how do we bring them to action. So in ending, this is the last poll. Do you feel like when you think about, you hear all this data around sustainable development, and some of it can be concerning, do you feel like you can make a difference in your organization or your community? So again, 1 is you feel like you can make no difference. 5, you feel like, yes, damn, I can make a huge difference.
Let's launch. People are answering, and I will just note we'll be looking to move into question and answer in a couple of minutes. Okay, looks great.
Okay, so we have of our audience out there, 25% say they don't feel like can make a difference. So we have so we have about 50% that say, yeah, they don't really feel like they can make that much of a difference. And then we have lots of 3s and 4s that people, feel like they can make somewhat a difference, but there's nobody saying, damn, yeah, I can make a huge difference out there. So that's interesting. And this is what I hear. I hear a lot from my students that I work with at Dalhousie and Acadia. Also, I've done a tri-nation study where I work with an institution, a business school in Liverpool and one in Lyon, France, working with 2 other scholars. And this was exactly kind of what we heard from our students in that tri-nation study, that a lot of times students feel like they cannot make a difference. But I would like to leave with this before we get into question and answer. This is one of my favorite quotes from Margaret Mead, who is the late great Margaret Mead, who was an American social scientist. And she said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And I share this one with my students a lot. And I just want to, before we move into the Q&A, that I want to say this, that I think that we all can make a difference, right? That 1 + 1, when we think of change from an exponential standpoint, can equal 100. And we've seen throughout history where a small group of people can make exponential change. And that if we engage in it, if we take on some of these frameworks and really engage in this idea of sustainable development as flourishing, and really kind of dream and imagine desired futures, I don't think there's nothing that we can't accomplish. We've seen through the pandemic how we took on the challenge of the pandemic and really rose to the challenge. And I think that sustainable development should be on that same level. We should be engaging in this as if our life mattered. And I think our life on this planet really does hinge on this, how we're going to move forward in the next decade or so. And so I will leave it there, and I'll stop my presentation and really open it up for any questions that people may have.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation, and so many thoughts and percolations, I'm sure, coming out of today's session. I'll just remind everyone we have both the chat function and Q&A open, but I'll get right in as we only have a few minutes left for questions. So the first one coming in is, when businesses do have a lot of priorities on the go at all one time. So how do you recommend to organizations to to really start, like how do you start that conversation or start integrating sustainable development into those business priorities and making it a part of those business priorities?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that a good starting point is really to look at what are your shared values of your organization? What is your mission statement? And mission statement is really your purpose statement. And what you'll find is a lot of organizations have that idea of uh, having positive impact, right? So you might want to revisit what are the values of the organization? What is your mission and what is the vision for the organization? And what the data shows is that sustainable development, and that's a part that I did not mention, it's an important piece. Sustainable development is profitable long run, maybe not short term, because you have to make changes, and anytime you make changes, there is growing pains with that. But what it shows is that sustainable development, which is more about being efficient, it's focused on health and well-being of your employees, and that's getting to be more of a priority for organizations. And that one story that came out of BC yesterday that says that health and well-being is at stake with climate change. Well, most organizations care about health and well-being. So I would say to answer that question goes back to really, as a organization, exploring your shared values, exploring what your mission is as an organization, and from there start to build how do we focus more on long-term thinking and connect it to you may want to look at what sustainable development goals. You may not want to take on all 17, but what might be 3 or 4 that are important to the organization? And then how do you build that into your value chain?
I think that's so insightful to really kind of go back to the beginning and go back to the core that's already there and already instated, so it doesn't feel so intangible and so, if it's not something you're familiar with, you just go back to those core principles. So I think
And
that's
I
a great
think that's
insight.
another point that I get my students, because that is a complaint about the SDGs, is that it's abstract and it's a lot. So
Mm,
where do you start? And I think it's really looking at what are the challenges you are facing as an organization. And then you look at the SDG and you can see, you'll be able to identify right away, okay, it's good health, well-being. Number 8, it's decent work. It's this idea of gender equality within our organization. So then you can say, these are the SDGs that are important to us. And then you can use things like the UN Global Compact to build
mhm.
strategies using the tools available to start to build those strategies. And once you identify the challenges, connect them to the abstract SDGs, you can start to build concrete strategies.
I think that's a great point, and kind of quite a few questions kind of all in that one answer. So thank you so much for that. And we're looking at the end here, so I'm going to squeeze one last in. You talked about, all of the VUCA, the disruption we've been having, all of these things, and that, leaders were not keeping up our thought processes, we're leaning on old things. So can you discuss that of how do we move forward? What skill sets are you seeing that we really need to focus on in our leaders, in our organizations, in those younger generations to get back up to pace and look to the future?
Yeah, I think it's, again, time. So quickly, I'll answer that. I think it's moving away from this hubris of expert knowledge. And in the scientific community, and we do depend on, research and study, but moving away from expert knowledge and really looking at transdisciplinary ways. There's multiple ways of knowing, and we've always showed up more from a Western way of knowing, but how can we engage in other ways of knowing? And I think it's really tapping into the diversity. And it's not really so much the knowledge that we have today that's going to get us out of these challenges. It's about how do we adapt? How do we be resilient? So I think it's more about
Mhm.
how do you build the capability and competencies in your leaders to be adaptable, to be open to change, and to prototype different ways of doing things. And I think that having that kind of mindset of moving away from this idea of expert leadership to building kind of a community of working together, this idea of participative architecture, taking on these challenges, and really allowing dialogues for innovation. And I think it's through
Mhm.
those innovative ways of knowing and being that allow us to be adaptable and resilient to change.
Fantastic. As they say, right, the only constant is change. So we have to be prepared. Okay, thank you so much. We actually have come to time, and I know we're actually 1 or 2 minutes over the hour. So I do want to thank everyone for their time today, particularly you, Ken. Thank you so much for all of this great information. And I'm sure a lot of conversation and action is going to be taken post this event. So I want to absolutely thank you for everything that you brought to the table today. Just a note again to our Work Wellness Institute members that your certificate of attendance will be automatically sent to you from attending this session today.
Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we're transforming research into workplace performance and health at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.